There's a moment Jung documented extensively when the empathic person who has completed differentiation encounters the narcissistic structure they once absorbed, regulated, and fused with. And what happens in this confrontation isn't what most people expect. There's no dramatic showdown, no winning argument, no moment where the narcissist finally sees what they've done. What happens is far more psychologically profound. Two incompatible realities meet, and the differentiated consciousness can no longer be destabilized by the undifferentiated one. This isn't about revenge or proving anything. It's about what Jung observed occurs when someone who has integrated shadow, developed sovereignty, and withdrawn from participation mystique encounters the psychological system that depended on their unconsciousness. The narcissist doesn't suddenly become conscious. The differentiated empath doesn't become cruel. What changes is the entire dynamic, because the fusion that enabled the relationship no longer exists. Jung spent decades studying these moments of psychological confrontation, not the surface drama, but the deeper structural incompatibility. When the differentiated empath returns to or remains in proximity with the narcissistic structure, something becomes immediately visible. Projection no longer lands. Guilt no longer destabilizes. Chaos no longer pulls them into reactivity. And this unavailability for fusion is what the narcissist experiences as the most devastating thing that could happen. Not because the empath is attacking, but because the empath is simply no longer there to absorb. Most explorations of narcissist-empath dynamics focus on either escape or exposure, getting away from the narcissist or revealing their true nature. But Jung's observation goes deeper into the psychological mechanism of what happens when escape isn't necessary because fusion is no longer possible. When you're differentiated, you can be in the same room, the same conversation, the same family system, and remain completely unavailable for the old dynamic, not through force, through genuine psychological reorganization. The narcissist can still project. They can still attempt manipulation. They can still create chaos, guilt, crisis. But Jung documented that when projection meets differentiated consciousness, something remarkable happens. The projection returns to sender, not because you're reflecting it back aggressively, but because there's no longer any participation mystique to receive it. You see it clearly. You recognize it as not yours, and you simply don't absorb it. This non-absorption is what creates the confrontation. Though confrontation is perhaps the wrong word, it's more like two fundamentally different psychological realities occupying the same space, and only one of them recognizes what's actually happening. The differentiated empath sees both realities clearly, their own differentiated consciousness and the narcissist's projection-based system. The narcissist only sees one reality. Their projections, which are no longer being absorbed, are bouncing back to them. And this return of projection to source is unbearable. Let's understand what Jung actually documented about this moment. In his work on projection and shadow, Jung observed that psychological systems built entirely on projection cannot function without someone receiving the projections. The narcissistic structure doesn't just prefer projection, it depends on it for basic psychological stability. Without someone absorbing their disowned shadow material, their system destabilizes rapidly. And for years, decades sometimes, you were the one absorbing. You absorbed their rage and experienced it as your anxiety. You absorbed their shame and experienced it as your inadequacy. You absorbed their emptiness and experienced it as your responsibility to fill them. This wasn't conscious on either side. It was participation mystique, the unconscious fusion Jung documented where boundaries between self and other dissolve completely. You didn't know you were absorbing projections. You thought you were feeling your own feelings, carrying your own burdens, managing your own chaos. But something happened. The participation mystique collapsed, maybe through crisis, maybe through exhaustion. Maybe through one projection too many that you finally recognized as not yours. However it happened, you differentiated. And differentiation, genuine psychological separation from fusion, changes you at a structural level. You don't just understand intellectually that their projections aren't yours. Your entire psychological system reorganizes to stop receiving them. This reorganization is what makes the confrontation inevitable. Because once you've differentiated, you cannot go back to unconscious absorption. Your body won't let you. Your psyche has developed what Jung called immunity to projection. You feel it approaching. You recognize it immediately. And instead of absorbing it into yourself and experiencing it as your own emotion, you see it clearly as theirs. This seeing, this psychological transparency to projection, is what makes you unavailable for the old dynamic. And when you become unavailable, they feel it viscerally. Not because you've announced your boundaries, not because you've explained your transformation, but because projection is an energetic exchange. When they project and you no longer receive, the energy has nowhere to go. It circles back to them. And suddenly they're in proximity with their own shadow material. The rage, shame, emptiness they've spent a lifetime externalizing onto others. This proximity is unbearable. Jung observed that the narcissist's first response to this unbearable proximity is always escalation. They increase the intensity of projection. They amplify the guilt. They create bigger crises. Because at some unconscious level, they're hoping that if they just make it intense enough, loud enough, chaotic enough, you'll go back to absorbing. You'll return to the old pattern where you sacrifice your stability to regulate theirs, where you abandon your reality to validate theirs, where you absorb their shadow so they don't have to hold it themselves. But the differentiated empath cannot return to this pattern, not because of willpower, not because of commitment to boundaries, but because the psychological structure that enabled absorption no longer exists. You've integrated too much shadow. You've developed too much sovereignty. You've completed too much individuation. The old fusion-based dynamic is psychologically impossible now. And when they escalate, you don't escalate back. You don't defend, you don't explain, you don't absorb. You simply remain in your own reality. Steady. Clear. Unavailable. This steadiness is what they experience as the confrontation. Because your calm is confronting their chaos. Your clarity is confronting their confusion. Your sovereignty is confronting their dependence on fusion. And these confrontations aren't happening through your words or actions. They're happening through your mere presence as differentiated consciousness. You've become a mirror, not reflecting back their projections, which is what they want, what they need, but reflecting their refusal to develop genuine self. Jung documented that mirrors are unbearable to those operating from defensive persona and chronic projection, because mirrors reveal what's actually there, and what's actually there, for the narcissistic structure, is emptiness. Not the generative emptiness Jung called the void, the space from which genuine self emerges, but defensive emptiness, the absence that results from a lifetime of projecting everything internal onto external targets. They have no center, because they've externalized everything that could have become center. Your differentiated presence reveals this emptiness, not through accusation, not through exposure, simply through being someone who has genuine center, genuine self, genuine internal stability that doesn't depend on absorbing others. And this revelation is the confrontation. They're confronted with what they lack every time they encounter what you've developed. They're confronted with their own refusal to individuate every time they witness your individuation. They're confronted with their commitment to unconsciousness every time they meet your consciousness. This is why the confrontation feels unbearable to them. It's not what you're doing, it's what you're being. And what you're being, differentiated, sovereign, psychologically complete, is everything their system was built to avoid becoming. Because becoming that would require facing shadow, integrating disowned material, developing genuine self rather than maintaining defensive persona. And they've organized their entire psychological structure around not doing this work. Jung observed that some narcissistic structures, when confronted with differentiated consciousness they cannot manipulate, simply leave. They find new targets, new people still operating from participation mystique who are available for fusion. This isn't conscious strategy. It's automatic psychological movement. They need someone to carry their shadow. You're no longer available. So they find someone who is. And often this departure feels like relief to both people. They get a new projection screen. You get freedom from chronic absorption. But sometimes they don't leave. Sometimes proximity to you is necessary. Shared children, family systems, work environments. And Jung documented that when the narcissistic structure cannot leave and cannot manipulate the differentiated empath back into fusion, something else happens. They attempt to destroy your credibility. Not with you. They've recognized you can't be gaslit anymore. But with others, with mutual friends, family members, colleagues, they begin a campaign of reality distortion about you. This is what Jung called projection at collective scale. They're projecting onto you not just in private fusion, but publicly. They're telling others you're the unstable one. You're the cruel one. You're the one who changed, who became cold, who abandoned them. And some people, those still operating from participation mystique themselves, will believe these projections. Because they don't have the differentiation to recognize projection when they see it. They absorb the narcissist's version of reality, just like you used to. But the differentiated empath, having integrated shadow and developed sovereignty, doesn't need everyone to see the truth. Jung observed that this is one of the most profound shifts that differentiation creates. You stop needing external validation of your reality. You know what's true. You can see the projection clearly. And whether others see it or not doesn't destabilize your knowing. This is psychological sovereignty. The capacity to exist in your own reality regardless of whether anyone else acknowledges it. This sovereignty is what makes you truly unavailable to the narcissist. Not just unavailable for fusion, but unavailable for destabilization through any mechanism they try. They can project. You recognize it. They can guilt. You see it's their shame. They can create chaos. You remain centered. They can attempt to turn others against you. You don't need those others' validation to know what's real. Every strategy that worked before hits this wall of differentiated consciousness and simply stops working. And Jung documented what happens to projection systems when they encounter this wall repeatedly. They either adapt or dissolve. Adaptation means the narcissistic structure begins, often unconsciously, to develop some capacity for holding their own material. Not full individuation, but enough differentiation to survive without your absorption. This is rare. Most narcissistic structures are too defended, too committed to unconsciousness, too identified with persona to do even minimal shadow work. More commonly, the system dissolves. The relationship ends. Or if it continues in form, marriage, family connection, professional collaboration, the psychological fusion is dead. You relate to them as you'd relate to any unconscious person, with clear boundaries, minimal expectation, zero investment in whether they ever see the truth. Jung called this mature acceptance. Not the acceptance that enables dysfunction, but the acceptance that recognizes limitation. You cannot do their individuation work for them. Let me be specific about what this confrontation looks like in lived experience. Because Jung's concepts can remain abstract unless we understand how they manifest in actual encounters, actual conversations, actual moments. When the differentiated empath encounters the narcissist after differentiation is complete, the first thing that becomes apparent is the complete absence of fusion. You're in the same physical space, but you're not in the same psychological space. They're still operating from the reality where projection should work, where fusion should be possible. You're operating from differentiated consciousness where projection is transparent and fusion is impossible. They might start with what used to work. Guilt. After everything I've done for you, this is how you'd treat me? The old you would have felt that guilt land, would have questioned yourself, would have wondered if maybe you were being too harsh. But the differentiated you recognizes projection immediately. You see that everything I've done for you was maintaining fusion that benefited them. You see that how you treat me actually means you're no longer absorbing my projections, and you don't absorb the guilt. You might acknowledge their feeling without accepting responsibility for it. I hear you're disappointed, but you don't take it in. Don't make it yours. Don't sacrifice your boundary to soothe their discomfort. This non-absorption, this refusal to make their feelings your responsibility, is what they experience as cruelty. Because in the old dynamic, your empathy meant absorbing. Your caring meant regulating them. Your love meant fusion. Now your empathy is boundaried. Your caring includes self-care. Your love requires differentiation. And they cannot understand this. To them, boundaried empathy isn't empathy. Differentiated love isn't love, because they've never experienced relationship outside participation mystique. So they escalate. Maybe they create a crisis, maybe they threaten, maybe they bring in others to validate their reality. Even your mother agrees you've changed, and the old you would have felt that pressure, would have wondered if everyone else sees something you're missing. But the differentiated you recognizes this as attempted manipulation through collective pressure. You see that you've changed is accurate. You have changed. You've differentiated. And that change doesn't require anyone else's approval. You might respond with simple honesty. Yes, I have changed, and offer no defense, no explanation, no absorption of their discomfort with your change. This steadiness, this capacity to remain centered while they escalate around you, is what Jung meant by psychological sovereignty. You're not defending against them. You're not attacking them. You're not trying to make them see. You're simply existing in your own reality. And that reality is incompatible with the fusion-based dynamic they're trying to recreate. Your calm becomes confronting to their chaos, not because you're trying to confront, but because the contrast between differentiated and undifferentiated consciousness is stark when they're in the same space. Jung observed that at some point in these encounters, the narcissist often shifts from trying to pull you back into fusion to trying to prove you were never differentiated at all. They'll point to any reaction you have as evidence you're still enmeshed. If you set a boundary, they'll call it aggression. If you don't engage, they'll call it passive aggression. If you explain yourself, they'll use your words against you. If you don't explain, they'll claim you're withholding. This isn't inconsistency on their part. It's the projection system trying every possible angle to destabilize differentiated consciousness back into participation mystique. But the differentiated empath, having integrated shadow, recognizes their own potential reactivity. You know when you're being genuinely aggressive versus when you're being accused of aggression for maintaining boundaries. You know when you're withholding versus when you're simply not over-explaining. You know the difference between your actual feelings and projected feelings you're being asked to carry. And this self-knowledge, this integrated shadow awareness, is what prevents their attempts at destabilization from working. The confrontation then becomes a kind of stalemate. They keep projecting, you keep not absorbing. They keep escalating, you keep remaining steady. They keep trying to recreate fusion, you keep existing in differentiation. And eventually, sometimes quickly, sometimes over years, they realize at some level that you're genuinely unavailable, not playing hard to get, not punishing them, not withholding to manipulate, but actually structurally, psychologically unavailable for the dynamic that once defined everything between you. This realization, when it comes, often looks like sudden withdrawal. They stop trying, stop contacting, stop engaging, not because they've had some breakthrough of consciousness, but because their projection system has recognized you're no longer viable as a target. Jung documented this as the moment when participation mystique dies completely, and with its death comes grief. For both people, though the grief means something entirely different to each. The narcissist grieves the loss of someone who absorbed their shadow, regulated their chaos, maintained their stability through chronic self-sacrifice. They grieve losing the one person who would sacrifice their reality to validate the narcissist's distorted version. They grieve the ending of fusion that felt like connection. But they're not grieving you. They're grieving what you provided, external regulation of their internal world, the absorption of projections they cannot hold themselves, the participation mystique that allowed them to avoid ever developing genuine self. The differentiated empath grieves something else entirely. You grieve the recognition that genuine relationship was never possible with this person, that what you thought was connection was participation mystique, that the person you loved was never actually present because they have no genuine self to be present with. You grieve the years spent trying to create consciousness in someone committed to unconsciousness, the energy spent absorbing projections that were never yours, the chronic self-abandonment that fusion required. But your grief, Jung observed, is clean. It's not mixed with fusion. It's not pulling you back into the old dynamic. It's the grief of mature acceptance. You're grieving what was never actually there while simultaneously recognizing that the ending was necessary. That continuing in fusion would have meant continued psychological destruction of self. That differentiation, though painful, was survival. And this grief, this clean grief without fusion, is evidence that differentiation is complete. Jung emphasized that the final confrontation isn't really about the narcissist at all. It's about you encountering your own transformation. You're confronting the person you used to be, the one who absorbed, fused, sacrificed, and recognizing you can never be that person again. You're confronting the old hope that if you just loved hard enough, sacrificed deeply enough, explained clearly enough, they'd finally see. And you're letting that hope die. Because that hope was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of psychological reality. You cannot create consciousness in someone who's committed to remaining unconscious. You cannot force individuation in someone whose entire identity depends on avoiding it. You cannot make someone develop genuine self when their whole system is built on defensive persona and chronic projection. And recognizing this, truly integrating this hard truth, is what allows you to stop trying. Not from bitterness, not from giving up on humanity, but from mature acceptance of what is. The differentiated empath who has completed this acceptance can coexist with narcissistic structures without being destabilized by them. Not because you've become hard or defended, but because you've become clear. You see the dynamic precisely. You recognize projection immediately. You maintain differentiation automatically. And you no longer need them to change, to see, to acknowledge your reality. You exist in your own reality regardless. And this existence, this sovereign presence, is what Jung called the goal of individuation. Let's explore what happens after the final confrontation. After the projection system has recognized you're no longer available. After the attempts to pull you back into fusion have failed. After the grief has been felt. Jung documented several possible outcomes, and understanding these helps contextualize what you might be experiencing or about to experience. Because the confrontation isn't actually the ending, it's a threshold. And what happens after crossing this threshold depends on multiple factors. The narcissist's capacity for even minimal differentiation, the structural requirements of continued proximity, and your own continued individuation. In some cases, the narcissist leaves completely. They find new targets for projection. New people still operating from participation mystique, who are available for fusion, and they repeat the entire pattern with someone else. Jung observed this as the compulsion to repeat, the unconscious pattern that cycles through different people but maintains the same psychological structure. For the narcissist, you become a ghost, someone they occasionally reference in their narrative as evidence of their victimhood, but someone they no longer actually relate to, because relating requires consciousness they haven't developed. In these cases, the differentiated empath often experiences relief mixed with residual grief. Relief because the chronic absorption has ended. The constant vigilance required to maintain boundaries against someone actively trying to violate them is over. The exhausting attempt to get them to see reality clearly has been abandoned. But grief because even though you knew genuine relationship wasn't possible, some part of you hoped they'd do their work, hoped consciousness would emerge, hoped that maybe, somehow, things could be different. Jung would say this hope was necessary for your own individuation, because as long as you maintained hope for their transformation, you weren't fully differentiated. Some part of you was still invested in their journey, still fused with their potential, still sacrificing your present reality for a future possibility that required their consciousness. When you finally release this hope, when you accept they are where they are and may always be where they are, you complete another layer of differentiation. You're no longer just differentiated from their projections. You're differentiated from hope itself as a form of fusion. But sometimes the narcissist doesn't leave. Sometimes structural reality requires continued proximity. Shared children, elderly parents, family businesses, professional collaborations that can't be dissolved without massive cost. And in these situations, Jung documented that the dynamic shifts into what he called parallel existence. You occupy the same external structures, family gatherings, co-parenting exchanges, work meetings, but you exist in completely different psychological realities. They continue to project, but you no longer receive projections as if they're information about you. You recognize them as information about the projector. They might say, "You're so cold now." The old you would have internalized this, worried about it, tried to prove you're not cold. The differentiated you recognizes this as projection of their own emptiness. You're not cold. You're boundaried. And they experience boundaries as coldness because fusion felt like warmth. You might respond with something neutral, "I hear you feel that way," or you might not respond at all, because your reality doesn't require their validation. This parallel existence requires enormous psychological energy from the differentiated person, because you're constantly translating. They speak from participation mystique. You speak from differentiation. Same words, completely different meanings. They say family should support each other, meaning, you should absorb my projections. You hear healthy families have members who've done their own individuation work. They say you've changed, meaning, you're no longer available for fusion. You hear, yes, I've differentiated. The gap is unbridgeable, but you can navigate it if you remain clear about which reality is actually real. Jung observed that maintaining parallel existence with narcissistic structures requires what he called conscious relationship to the unconscious. You're relating to someone who's unconscious, and you must remain conscious of their unconsciousness without trying to make them conscious. This is perhaps the most difficult psychological position to maintain, because every interaction contains the temptation to explain, to educate, to hope they'll finally see. But explanation to someone committed to not seeing is participation in unconsciousness. Your consciousness is maintained by recognizing the futility of explanation. The differentiated empath in parallel existence with narcissistic structures often becomes a kind of psychological witness. You witness their projections without absorbing them. You witness their escalations without reacting. You witness their manipulation attempts without being manipulated. And this witnessing, this capacity to see clearly without fusing, is both your protection and your burden. Protection because you cannot be pulled back into unconscious participation. Burden because you're constantly aware of dynamics others still fused into cannot see. Jung documented that this position of witness often creates social isolation, even within family or professional systems, because you see the projection and manipulation that others don't see. You recognize the performance that others accept as genuine. You understand the systematic reality distortion that others have normalized. And when you try to name what you're seeing, even gently, even with compassion, you're often experienced as the problem. Because truth-telling destabilizes systems built on collective unconsciousness. This is where the differentiated empath must make constant choices about whether to speak or remain silent. Jung's guidance here is subtle. He observed that speaking truth to those committed to unconsciousness rarely creates consciousness. It creates defensiveness. Because truth threatens the psychological structures they've built to avoid consciousness. But remaining silent in the face of clear dysfunction can feel like complicity, like enabling, like abandoning others who might be helped by truth. The resolution Jung offered is this: speak truth when asked directly by someone genuinely seeking. Remain silent when truth would only serve your need to be understood. And develop the discrimination to know the difference. Someone genuinely seeking consciousness asks questions that reveal openness. What do you see happening here? Help me understand this dynamic. Someone committed to unconsciousness asks questions that are actually accusations. Don't you think you're overreacting? Why are you always so negative about them? The first is genuine inquiry. The second is attempted manipulation back into collective unconsciousness. The differentiated empath learns to respond to genuine inquiry and to meet accusation as question with silence or deflection. Not because you're avoiding truth-telling, but because you've learned that truth offered to those not seeking it becomes another weapon they use against themselves or against you. Your silence in these moments is compassion. You're not withholding truth. You're recognizing that consciousness cannot be forced. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is allow people to remain where they are until they're ready for something different. But there's a third possible outcome after the final confrontation that Jung documented, though he noted it's exceedingly rare. Sometimes, very rarely, the confrontation with differentiated consciousness creates enough psychological crisis in the narcissistic structure that some minimal differentiation begins. Not full individuation. Not complete shadow integration. But enough consciousness develops that participation mystique is no longer their only mode of relating. Jung was careful to note that this transformation almost never happens because of the differentiated person's efforts. It happens because the narcissistic structure's entire system has failed so completely. They've lost every target for projection, every source of external validation, every person willing to absorb their shadow, that remaining unconscious becomes more painful than the work of becoming conscious. They hit what recovery communities call rock bottom, what Jung called the encounter with the void that cannot be externalized onto anyone else. When this happens, and again Jung stressed how rare this is, the differentiated empath often doesn't recognize it at first, because the narcissist's initial attempts at differentiation look almost identical to their manipulation. They say things like, "I'm working on myself," or "I'm in therapy," or "I realize I have problems." The differentiated empath, having heard these claims before in service of manipulation, remains appropriately skeptical. You maintain boundaries. You watch for actual behavioral change rather than accepting verbal promises. Jung documented that genuine beginning of individuation in someone who's been operating from chronic projection shows up in very specific ways. They stop projecting quite as reflexively. They catch themselves mid-manipulation and apologize. Awkwardly, incompletely, but genuinely. They tolerate your boundaries without escalating. They begin, sometimes painfully, to hold their own emotional states rather than immediately externalizing them. These changes are subtle. They're inconsistent. They're often 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But they're real. The differentiated empath who witnesses this beginning of consciousness in the other faces a profound choice. Do you allow the possibility of different relationship? Do you lower boundaries that have protected you? Do you risk the vulnerability of hoping again? Jung's guidance here is both compassionate and realistic. Hope is fine. Trust must be earned. You can witness their individuation with genuine support, but you do not sacrifice your own differentiation to enable their journey. You do not return to fusion to make their consciousness work easier. You do not absorb their projections, even when they're trying hard not to project. If their differentiation is genuine, it will continue whether you absorb or not. If it's manipulation disguised as growth, your refusal to absorb will reveal it quickly. Either way, your differentiation remains non-negotiable. You can love them. You can support their growth. You can hope for their consciousness, but you do all of this from sovereign position, never again from fusion. Because fusion, Jung observed, isn't love. It's the absence of self masquerading as connection. And here's what makes this third outcome so psychologically interesting when it does occur. 2 differentiated people meeting after one of them has emerged from narcissistic structure creates relationship Jung called genuine for the first time. Not the fusion that felt like connection, but actual meeting between 2 sovereign beings who can see each other clearly, who can hold their own shadow, who can relate without projection. This relationship looks nothing like what came before. It's quieter, more honest, less dramatic, and often more genuinely intimate than fusion ever was. But Jung warned against romanticizing this outcome, because even if minimal differentiation begins in the formerly narcissistic person, years of operating from projection have created deep patterns. Patterns that don't disappear just because consciousness has begun to emerge. They will still project sometimes. They will still manipulate sometimes. They will still default to old patterns under stress. The difference is they can now recognize when they're doing it, at least sometimes, and they can choose differently. Your work, as the already differentiated person, is to maintain clear boundaries around projection even when their consciousness is emerging, to support their growth without sacrificing your sovereignty, to witness their struggle with compassion while refusing to absorb their shadow for them. This is delicate work. It requires you to hold both the reality of their beginning differentiation and the reality of their ongoing patterns, to be neither naively hopeful nor cynically dismissive, to exist in what Jung called the middle ground, the space of mature realism that can acknowledge both growth and limitation. Most people who've differentiated from narcissistic dynamics never experience this third outcome. The narcissist either leaves completely or parallel existence becomes the permanent reality. But understanding this possibility, that consciousness can emerge even in structures that seemed permanently defended against it, prevents the differentiated empath from hardening into cynicism. You're not hoping for their consciousness as a way of avoiding grief. You're not waiting for their transformation as postponement of your own life. But you're remaining open to the possibility that consciousness can emerge anywhere, anytime, in anyone, while simultaneously not needing it to emerge to maintain your own differentiation. This is psychological sovereignty at its most mature. You hold your own reality. You maintain your own boundaries. You continue your own individuation. And you remain open to consciousness emerging in others without being dependent on it, without sacrificing for it, without fusing to enable it. This position, fully differentiated but not defended, sovereign but not isolated, clear but not closed, is what Jung spent his life trying to articulate and embody. The final confrontation, then, isn't just about encountering the narcissist. It's about encountering yourself as differentiated, being capable of relating to unconsciousness without becoming unconscious, capable of witnessing projection without absorbing it, capable of loving without fusing, capable of hoping without depending, capable of existing in your own reality while acknowledging others exist in completely different realities. This capacity, this psychological flexibility, combined with unwavering center, is what Jung called individuation, reaching maturity. And from this mature position, you recognize that the confrontation was never with them at all. It was with your own participation in fusion, your own complicity in absorption, your own hope that was actually avoidance of differentiation. They were the catalyst. But the work was always yours. The consciousness was always yours to develop. The sovereignty was always yours to claim. And the differentiation was always what your psyche was moving toward, whether your conscious self knew it or not. This understanding, that the whole dynamic was serving your individuation, doesn't make what happened okay, doesn't excuse their projection or manipulation, doesn't minimize the harm or the years spent in fusion, but it does integrate the experience into your individuation journey. Jung observed that when empathic people who've differentiated from narcissistic dynamics reach this level of integration, something profound happens. The resentment dissolves, not through forced forgiveness, but through recognition that every aspect of the dynamic was psychologically necessary for you to develop the consciousness you now have. You don't thank them. You don't minimize what happened. You don't reconcile in some false healing narrative. But you stop being defined by what happened. You stop identifying primarily as survivor of narcissistic abuse. You become simply someone who has done profound psychological work and emerged individuated on the other side. The narcissistic dynamic becomes part of your history, but it's no longer the center of your identity. And this shift, from identification with the wound to identification with the wholeness that integrated the wound, is what Jung called psychological gold, the treasure hidden in the shadow, the individuation that emerges from working with what tried to destroy you. The final confrontation, ultimately, is between who you were and who you've become. The narcissist is just the screen onto which that internal confrontation gets projected for a while. And when you've completed the internal work, when you've integrated shadow, developed sovereignty, withdrawn from participation mystique, accepted that consciousness cannot be forced in others, grieved what was never possible, and claimed your own reality as sufficient regardless of whether anyone else ever sees it, the external confrontation simply ends. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it just fades. They're there or they're not. They've changed or they haven't. And it no longer matters to your psychological reality, because your psychological reality is finally, completely, irreversibly yours. This is what Jung meant by individuation. This is what differentiation creates. This is who you become when participation mystique collapses, and you do the work of integrating everything that emerges from the collapse. You become someone real, someone true, someone sovereign, someone who can finally live your actual life rather than the life that fusion demanded. And this life, your life, finally your own, is what Jung called the life worth living. The confrontation is over, not because anyone won, but because the consciousness that emerges from genuine differentiation makes winning irrelevant. You're not competing for reality with someone who operates from projection. You're simply existing in your reality, sovereign, clear, unavailable for fusion, and completely at peace with everything this unavailability costs and everything it makes possible. This is the final confrontation. And it's final not because you'll never see them again, but because you'll never be available for unconscious fusion again, and that unavailability changes everything. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to breathe, and remember that awareness grows when it's shared. Subscribe, so you don't lose your way when the next reflection arrives. Leave a like. It helps this message reach others who need to hear it but don't yet know why. And share your thoughts below, because every comment here becomes a spark, one awakened mind helping another remember. Together we move beyond the dark.